5,400 meters beneath the Pacific Ocean, a warship sits upright on the seafloor, impossibly intact for something that burned for 7 hours before it sank. The carrier is massive, stretching nearly 800 feet from bow to stern. Her single smokestack still recognizable even after 77 years in the abyss. This is Kaga, one of 6 Japanese carriers that struck Pearl Harbor, and she is frozen in a moment that changed naval warfare forever. But here is the paradox that makes her wreck so haunting. Kaga didn't just participate in the doctrine that revolutionized carrier operations. She became the perfect demonstration of that doctrine's fatal flaw, a living proof that the same tactics that deliver overwhelming victory can, when turned against you, deliver equally overwhelming defeat. 4 questions have puzzled historians and researchers since her discovery in 2019. First, what design compromise, born from her origins as something completely different, made her catastrophically vulnerable when American dive bombers finally found her? Second, why did it take 77 years to locate her main hull when searchers knew roughly where she went down? Third, what did the wreck's final resting position reveal that contradicted the historical record of her last moments? And fourth, how did the debris field pattern tell a story that survivor accounts had only hinted at for decades? The answers lie in a conversion that should never have worked, in a battle that lasted 5 minutes but decided a war, and in a search that almost ended 20 years too soon. This is the story of how Kaga went from being a symbol of Japanese naval innovation to becoming a classroom on the ocean floor, teaching lessons about vulnerability, doctrine, and the thin margin between triumph and catastrophe. October 18, 2019. The research vessel Petrel's autonomous underwater vehicle detects an anomaly 17,700 feet below the surface, northwest of Midway Atoll. The sonar returns are unmistakable. A linear structure, far too regular to be geological, sits in a debris field larger than Manhattan itself. When the data resolves, the expedition team sees what they have been searching for across thousands of square miles of ocean floor: the distinctive silhouette of a fleet carrier. Her hull is remarkably preserved, resting upright as if she simply settled into the mud and decided to stay. The single funnel configuration is visible even through 77 years of corrosion and marine growth. This is one of Paul Allen's final expeditions, completed posthumously after the Microsoft co-founder's death in October 2018. Allen's passion for maritime archaeology had driven him to fund searches that others considered impossible. His research vessel, Petrel, was equipped with technology that could search deeper, longer, and more systematically than any previous expedition. The mission was clear: locate and document the 4 Japanese carriers lost at the Battle of Midway, the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War. Kaga was part of the Kido Butai, the concentrated carrier striking force that perfected a revolutionary way of waging war at sea. She helped prove that aircraft carriers were not just battleship escorts or auxiliary vessels providing reconnaissance. They were the new capital ships capable of projecting devastating power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon, making the battleship's massive guns suddenly obsolete before they could even see the enemy. But 6 months after Pearl Harbor's triumph, Kaga became a victim of her own doctrine at Midway, caught in the exact vulnerable moment that Japanese strategists had taught the world to exploit. The wreck's position would later reveal something unexpected about her final moments, a detail that challenged decades of accepted history and refined our understanding of what happened in those chaotic final hours. But before we understand how Kaga died, we need to understand how she was born, because her origins contained the flaw that would kill her. Before we continue, a quick reminder: subscribing is the easiest way to support the channel. It helps us dedicate more time to uncovering these sunken stories, accessing archival materials, and preserving maritime history for everyone who loves the sea. Your support makes these deep dives possible. Now let's get back to Kaga's story. Kaga's story begins with compromise, with international politics forcing navies to adapt and innovate within artificial constraints. She was laid down at Kawasaki Heavy Industries in Kobe on November 17, 1921, not as an aircraft carrier, but as a Tosa-class battleship. She was designed to dominate surface engagements with 10 16-inch guns to slug it out with enemy battleships in the kind of decisive fleet engagement that naval strategists had dreamed about since before World War I. Her name, meaning increased joy, came from an old province in central Japan. Then the Washington Naval Treaty intervened, fundamentally reshaping naval power across the world. Signed in 1922, the treaty imposed strict limits on battleship construction among major naval powers, attempting to prevent another naval arms race, like the one that had preceded World War I. Japan was forced to make difficult choices about which hulls to complete and which to scrap or convert. Kaga's fate hung in the balance. Originally, Japan planned to convert the battlecruiser Amagi into an aircraft carrier, while Kaga would be scrapped to meet treaty obligations. But on September 1, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake struck Japan with devastating force. The earthquake killed over 100,000 people and caused massive destruction across the Tokyo-Yokohama area. Among the casualties was Amagi, under conversion at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Her hull was damaged beyond economical repair when the building dock collapsed. Japan needed a replacement conversion to meet both treaty requirements and the Navy's growing recognition that carrier aviation represented the future of naval power. Kaga became that replacement. Her battleship heritage gave her unusual characteristics that would define her entire career. She inherited a thick armor belt designed to protect against battleship shells, making her more survivable in surface combat than purpose-built carriers. She had powerful machinery capable of driving her massive hull to 28 knots, faster than most battleships, though slower than battlecruiser-derived carriers. She displaced 38 200 tons when fully loaded, making her one of the larger carriers in any navy. Her hull was robust, capable of absorbing punishment. But that battleship heritage also gave her a critical vulnerability that would prove fatal at Midway. To save weight during the conversion, to keep her displacement within treaty limits, designers installed wooden flight deck planking over her armored superstructure. This was a common weight-saving measure in early carrier design, but it created a catastrophic fire risk that purpose-built carriers would later avoid. Between 1933 and 1935, Kaga underwent massive reconstruction that transformed her from an experimental early carrier into a modern fleet carrier. Her original three-tiered flight deck, an experimental design that had never worked properly, was replaced with a single, elongated deck stretching 248.55 meters. The triple-deck design had been based on the idea that aircraft could land on one level while others took off from another, with a third level for parking. In practice, it was a nightmare of interfering air patterns and dangerous approaches. The reconstruction eliminated this complexity in favor of a single efficient deck. Her aircraft capacity increased dramatically to 90 planes, including 18 spares. This gave her striking power that rivaled any carrier in the world. Her island superstructure was refined, positioned on the starboard side following standard naval architecture. She carried 10 200mm guns for anti-surface combat, though these would never fire a shot in anger. She mounted 8 twin 127mm gun positions for anti-aircraft defense, though this would prove woefully inadequate against determined air attack. By 1941, Kaga was a formidable weapon, capable of launching a devastating strike package, 27 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters to establish air superiority, 27 Aichi D-3A dive bombers to attack with precision, and 27 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers to deliver ship-killing blows. This was the perfect combination for deep offensive operations, for striking enemies before they could react, for executing the doctrine that would make the Kido Butai the most feared naval force in the Pacific. December 7, 1941, at 6:15 in the morning, Kaga's flight deck erupts with controlled chaos as the first wave launches from a position 230 miles north of Oahu. The morning is clear, with excellent visibility. The 6 carriers of the Kido Butai have achieved complete surprise. Admiral Nagumo's gamble, bringing his carriers within, striking range undetected, has paid off. The doctrine being executed this morning is revolutionary, and Kaga is at the heart of it. The traditional way of using carriers had been to disperse them with battleship groups, to use them as scouts and auxiliary forces supporting the real capital ships. Japanese naval aviation had argued for years that this was wrong, that carriers should be concentrated together, that their true power lay in massed strikes that could overwhelm any defense. Pearl Harbor would prove this doctrine correct in the most dramatic way possible. Kaga's bombers and torpedo planes are part of a meticulously coordinated strike involving 183 aircraft from 6 carriers. They find their targets in Pearl Harbor's confined waters, where the American battleships are moored in neat rows, perfect targets for the torpedo bombers and horizontal bombers. Kaga's aircraft contribute to the destruction of Battleship Row, helping to sink or damage 8 battleships in less than 2 hours. The attack achieves its primary objective. The American Pacific Fleet's battle line is shattered, unable to interfere with Japanese operations for months to come. But Pearl Harbor wasn't where Kaga first proved the concept of carrier warfare. That had happened earlier, during Japan's operations in China. In February 1932, during the Shanghai incident, Kaga's fighters scored the Imperial Japanese Navy's first air-to-air victory, shooting down a Chinese aircraft and demonstrating that carrier-based fighters could establish air superiority far from their base. That engagement, small as it was, validated the investment Japan had made in carrier aviation. The doctrine Kaga helped perfect at Pearl Harbor was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Concentrate carriers together rather than dispersing them, creating a force that could launch 300 or 400 aircraft in a single coordinated strike. Launch mass preemptive strikes against enemy forces before they can organize effective resistance. Emphasize speed and surprise over sustained operations, hitting hard and fast, then withdrawing before the enemy can counterattack effectively. Use carrier aircraft not just for reconnaissance or tactical support, but as the primary striking arm of the fleet. After Pearl Harbor, the rampage continued across the Pacific. Kaga participated in strikes against Rabaul in January 1942, helping to neutralize Australian air power in New Britain. She supported operations in the Dutch East Indies, providing air cover for invasion forces and striking at Allied shipping. On February 19, 1942, she participated in the devastating raid on Darwin, Australia, launching strikes that destroyed ships, aircraft, and port facilities in what Australians would call their own Pearl Harbor. For 6 months, the Kido Butai operated with apparent invincibility. 6 carriers launched coordinated strikes across thousands of miles of ocean. They suffered 0 losses in major combat units. The doctrine worked perfectly because it attacked enemies before they could organize effective resistance, destroying their ability to fight back before they even knew they were under attack. Japanese naval aviators began to believe they were unstoppable. Japanese planners assumed the same approach would deliver victory at Midway. The plan was ambitious: draw out the remaining American carriers, destroy them with overwhelming force, and secure Japan's defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Midway atoll would be occupied, providing a base for further operations. The American fleet, already weakened by Pearl Harbor and months of defensive operations, would be finished as an effective fighting force. What Japanese planners didn't account for was what happens when this doctrine encounters an enemy who knows you're coming. American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval codes, giving Admiral Nimitz detailed knowledge of Japanese plans and intentions. The Americans knew when the Japanese would strike, where they would strike, and with what forces. They positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, in the one place Japanese reconnaissance was unlikely to search, and they waited for the perfect moment, the vulnerable moment that the Japanese doctrine had taught them to recognize. June 4, 1942, at 10:20 in the morning. Kaga's flight deck is organized chaos, the kind that happens when a carrier is simultaneously launching fighters for combat air patrol while preparing for a major strike against newly discovered American carriers. The deck is crowded with aircraft positioned closely together to maximize limited space. Ordnance lies scattered among fuel lines that snake across the deck. Bombs and torpedoes wait to be loaded onto aircraft. Refueling hoses are connected to fighters that have just landed and need to get back into the air immediately. This is the doctrine's fatal vulnerability, the moment between strikes when a carrier is most exposed. Every carrier experiences this moment, this chaotic transition when the deck is crowded with aircraft, ordnance, and fuel, when defensive combat air patrol has been depleted, when the ship is simultaneously most dangerous and most vulnerable. Japanese doctrine emphasized hitting the enemy during this exact moment. Now Kaga is experiencing it herself. At 10:22 a.m., approximately 25 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise roll into their attacks. They had been searching for the Japanese carriers for hours, burning fuel, some planes running so low they would never make it back to Enterprise. They had almost given up when a straggling Japanese destroyer led them straight to the target. Now they're overhead, and they're diving. The dauntless pilots see a target-rich environment below them. 4 carriers positioned close together for mutual support, exactly as Japanese doctrine prescribed. The carriers are turning into the wind, preparing to launch. Their decks are packed. The pilots roll into near-vertical dives, pushing their aircraft past 250 knots, past 300 knots, the wings screaming as they plunge toward the deck. The first 1,000-pound bomb strikes Kaga's forward elevator, hitting with devastating precision. The explosion is massive, the blast wave blowing the elevator upward, lifting the entire platform out of its well and tossing it onto the flight deck like a piece of cardboard. The hole left behind is enormous, and through it, fire and smoke pour upward from the hangar deck below. The second bomb hits the aft elevator with similar effect. Another massive explosion, another elevator blown upward out of its well. The hangar deck below is exposed to the open air, and flames are already spreading from ruptured fuel lines and detonating ordnance. The third bomb strikes near the island's superstructure, the explosion tearing through the bridge and killing most of the command staff instantly. Captain Jisaku Okada and his senior officers die within seconds. Command structure on Kaga collapses immediately. The fourth bomb hits amidships, penetrating deep into the hangar deck where 80,000 pounds of munitions are stored. The explosion that follows is catastrophic, a secondary blast that tears through the ship's internal structure. Aviation gasoline ignites, sending a fireball through the hangar deck. Bombs and torpedoes begin cooking off in the intense heat, each explosion adding to the chaos. The entire sequence, from the first bomb to the last, takes perhaps 30 seconds. 4 hits from 4 different dive bombers, but the damage is irreversible and catastrophic. Kaga's wooden flight deck ignites immediately, the flames spreading faster than any damage control team can respond. The fire feeds on ruptured fuel lines, on scattered ordnance, on the wooden deck itself. Within minutes, the entire flight deck is ablaze. For 7 hours, Kaga's crew fights the inferno. Damage control parties advance into the flames with hoses, only to be driven back by explosions. The ship's fire mains are ruptured, reducing water pressure to a trickle. Portable pumps are brought up, but the fire has too much fuel, too much material to burn. The wooden flight deck continues burning uncontrollably. By contrast, American carriers used steel flight decks that resisted fire spread, that could be cooled with water, that didn't add fuel to the fire. Kaga's wooden deck, that weight-saving measure from her battleship conversion, has become a fatal vulnerability. The critical design flaw is now fully apparent. When American bombs penetrated those wooden decks, they created fires that couldn't be controlled. When the same bombs hit American carriers with steel decks, like USS Yorktown, the damage was severe but containable. The material choice made 15 years earlier, made to save weight and meet treaty restrictions, is now killing Kaga and her crew. Survivors would later describe a scene of hell, fires burning out of control throughout the ship, explosions ripping through compartments, smoke so thick that men couldn't see their hands in front of their faces, the heat so intense that metal glowed and paint burst into flame spontaneously, men trapped below decks, unable to reach escape routes, others making desperate choices, jumping overboard rather than burning alive. At approximately 4:25 p.m., the order comes to abandon ship. The crew has fought for nearly 7 hours, but there's nothing left to save. Kaga is finished. Destroyers move alongside to take off survivors. Men jump from the carrier's sides into the water, where rescue boats pick them up. 800 survivors are pulled from the water, exhausted, burned, many injured. 814 men are not so fortunate. They die in the initial attack, in the subsequent fires, or trapped below decks, as the ship settles lower in the water. But even after abandonment, Kaga doesn't sink. She floats, burning, a beacon visible for miles. She has become an enormous funeral pyre, a symbol of the Kido Butai's destruction. 3 other carriers are also burning or have already sunk. The doctrine that worked so perfectly at Pearl Harbor has been turned against its creators with devastating effectiveness. At approximately 7:25 p.m. on June 4th, the destroyer Hagekaze delivers the final blow. 2 torpedoes strike Kaga's hull, the explosions opening her to the sea. At 7:25 p.m., after 7 hours of burning, Kaga slips beneath the waves. She takes 814 men with her into the darkness, settling onto the seafloor 17,700 feet below, where she will rest undisturbed for 77 years. For decades, Kaga's final resting place remained approximate. Wartime navigation fixes, taken in the chaos of battle and retreat, put her somewhere northwest of Midway Atoll, in water deeper than 17,000 feet. But the Pacific Ocean is vast beyond human comprehension. Searching even a relatively small area at those depths requires technology and resources that didn't exist for decades after the war. In May 1999, Robert Ballard's Nauticos Corporation made the first serious attempt to locate the Midway carriers. Using deep-towed sonar systems, they searched a grid pattern based on historical records and survivor accounts. They found something, a debris field at approximately 17,000 feet. A 50-foot section of hangar deck, gun tubs, and scattered wreckage. They had found pieces of Kaga, fragments blown off during the explosions or shaken loose during the descent. But they hadn't found the main hull. The ship herself remained hidden. The debris field provided tantalizing clues, but frustrating limitations. The wreckage confirmed that Kaga had sunk in the general area, but without the main hull, there was no way to establish exact positions or conduct detailed forensic analysis. The team searched surrounding areas, but found nothing more. The expedition ended with partial success, enough to confirm they were searching in the right area, but not enough to claim discovery of the wreck itself. 20 years passed. Technology advanced. Deep ocean search capabilities improved dramatically. Paul Allen's research vessel, Petrel, represented the state of the art in underwater search and documentation. The ship was equipped with autonomous underwater vehicles rated for depths exceeding 6,000 meters, far deeper than Kaga's resting place. These AUVs could conduct systematic grid searches with side-scan sonar through multiple overlapping passes, creating detailed maps of the seafloor. The Petrel expedition employed a methodical approach. They used historical records to establish the most likely search area, then divided it into grid sections. The autonomous underwater vehicles worked each section systematically, scanning the seafloor with sonar, looking for anomalies that might indicate a wreck. Days passed with nothing but seafloor geology, then weeks. The search area was vast, and even with advanced technology, finding a single ship at these depths was like searching for a specific car in a city the size of Los Angeles. The search area fell within Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument, one of the largest marine conservation areas in the world. Permits had to be obtained from both American and Japanese authorities. Environmental protocols had to be followed meticulously. The expedition operated under strict guidelines to ensure that any wrecks found would be treated as war graves and left completely undisturbed. No artifacts would be recovered. No salvage would be attempted. This was pure documentation for historical and educational purposes. on October 18, 2019, the breakthrough finally came. An autonomous underwater vehicle completed a sonar pass that detected an anomaly, a massive linear structure at 17 to the 700 feet depth, exactly the kind of return you'd expect from a large warship. The initial data was promising, but not conclusive. The team programmed the AUV for another pass, this time with higher resolution settings. When that data returned, there was no doubt. This was a fleet carrier sitting upright on the seafloor. But which carrier? 4 Japanese carriers had sunk at Midway: Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu. The team needed positive identification before they could announce the discovery. They deployed a remotely operated vehicle for a confirmation dive, descending 7,700 feet into complete darkness to photograph the wreck with high-resolution cameras. The ROV's descent took hours, dropping through water layers with different temperatures and pressures, finally reaching the seafloor where eternal darkness and crushing pressure had preserved the wreck. When the lights illuminated the hull, the expedition team saw a remarkable sight. A carrier sitting upright, as if she had simply settled onto the bottom and decided to remain there. Her superstructure was heavily damaged, much of it collapsed or blown away, but her hull was remarkably intact. The forensic identification process began immediately. The team measured the wreck's overall length at approximately 238 to 240 meters, matching Kaga's post-reconstruction dimensions within measurement tolerances. The single funnel configuration was visible, though damaged. This was significant because Akagi had a unique funnel arrangement that directed gases downward, while Kaga had a more conventional single stack. The island superstructure, though heavily damaged, was clearly positioned on the starboard side, following standard naval architecture. This helped rule out Akagi, whose island was uniquely positioned on the port side. But Soryu and Hiryu also had starboard islands, so this wasn't definitive by itself. The team looked for more distinctive features. They found the battleship origin armor belt, showing plates approximately 203 millimeters thick. This was consistent with Kaga's battleship heritage. They examined the forward elevator, which showed massive damage, consistent with an upward explosion that had lifted it completely out of its well. They found gun positions that matched historical photographs of Kaga's armament. Then they found something conclusive. Markings on the bow section, though corroded and covered with marine growth, were still partially visible. When enhanced and analyzed, these markings matched Kaga's hull number and identification. Combined with all the other evidence, the identification was certain. This was Kaga, flagship of the 1st Carrier Division at Pearl Harbor, now resting in eternal darkness. In October 2019, the Japanese government officially recognized the wreck as a war grave, confirming the identification and ensuring the site would be protected under international maritime law. The announcement made headlines around the world. One of the most significant carriers in naval history had been found, and her condition was far better than anyone had expected. But the wreck's position revealed something unexpected, something that challenged the historical record. Kaga had drifted approximately 20 miles northwest during her 7-hour death spiral, ending up farther from the battle area than wartime estimates had suggested. This detail refined historians' understanding of ocean currents and drift patterns for mortally wounded ships. But it also raised questions. Why had she drifted so far? The answer lay in those 7 hours between the bomb hits and her final sinking. Kaga had remained afloat far longer than anyone realized, drifting with wind and current while her crew fought the fires. The torpedo strikes from Hagakaze, intended as mercy shots to end her agony, had taken longer to sink her than expected. She had time to drift, to move away from the battlefield, to settle in a location that would remain mysterious for 77 years. The debris field pattern told its own story. The 50-foot section of hangar deck that Ballard's team found in 1999 had been blown off during the initial explosions or the subsequent detonations as ordnance cooked off. It had drifted separately from the main hull, settling 400 meters away. This explained why finding the debris field hadn't led directly to the main hull. The two had separated during the violent descent through 17,000 feet of water. The wreck's upright orientation suggested either a controlled sinking or a capsizing, followed by righting during descent. The forensic evidence suggested the latter. Kaga had likely rolled partially during her death throes as flooding became asymmetric, then righted herself as she descended, the heavy battleship origin hull pulling her upright as she settled onto the soft mud of the ocean floor. Kaga's discovery offers value that extends far beyond satisfying historical curiosity. Scientifically, she represents an important case study in deep ocean preservation. The extreme pressure at 17,700 feet, exceeding 7,500 pounds per square inch, combined with near-freezing temperatures and complete absence of light, creates conditions that slow metal degradation significantly. Kaga is corroding, but far more slowly than wrecks in shallower water. Marine biologists have documented chemosynthetic communities around the wreck, organisms that derive energy from chemical processes rather than sunlight. These communities exist nowhere else in the open ocean at these depths, relying on the wreck itself as a substrate and as a source of chemical energy as the metal slowly corrodes. The hull has become an artificial reef in the abyssal zone, supporting ecosystems that would not otherwise exist here. The wreck functions as a time capsule, preserving evidence of 1940s naval architecture and damage patterns that can be studied without the biases that come from examining survivors' accounts alone. The forensic evidence settled long-standing debates about damage sequence and structural failure patterns. The hangar deck explosions clearly preceded the flight deck collapse, validating some survivor accounts while contradicting others. The position and extent of bomb damage could be measured precisely, allowing historians to reconstruct the attack sequence with unprecedented accuracy. For 14 families whose relatives went down with Kaga, the discovery provided something invaluable: closure. For 77 years, the location of their loved one's final rest had been approximate, known only within a search area of hundreds of square miles. Now it is precise, measured to within meters. While the wreck itself is protected and cannot be visited, knowing exactly where their relatives rest brings a form of peace that was impossible before October 2019. War graves deserve this precision, this respect, this certainty. The fallen deserve to be remembered not as approximations or estimates, but as individuals whose final locations are known and honored. The protection afforded to Kaga under both American and Japanese law ensures that this war grave will remain undisturbed, that the 814 men who rest with her will be left in peace. There is a profound symbolic symmetry in modern Japan's newest carriers. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force commissioned J.S. Kaga designated DDH-184 in 2017. She is a helicopter destroyer, a Izumo-class ship that is currently being modified to operate F-35B Lightning II stealth fighters. When those modifications are complete, she will be Japan's first true aircraft carrier since World War II, coming full circle to carrier operations after decades of focusing on defensive helicopter operations. The modern Kaga's name is written in hiragana, a subtle linguistic distinction that honors the past while clearly differentiating the new ship from the old. She represents continuity between Japan's maritime history and its defensive future, carrying forward a name that reminds everyone of both the triumphs and the lessons of 1942. Through modern technology, through virtual access and photogrammetry, global audiences can now study the Pearl Harbor carrier without disturbing the war grave. Educational programs use the REC data to teach about naval warfare, about carrier operations, about the Battle of Midway. Kaga has become a teaching resource that instructs from 17,700 feet down, her very existence a lesson about vulnerability, about doctrine, about the price of strategic miscalculation. Kaga rests under the protection of both United States and Japanese law as a designated war grave. The Sunken Military Craft Act prohibits any salvage or disturbance of her remains without explicit authorization from both governments. International maritime law reinforces these protections, recognizing war graves as sacred sites regardless of nationality. The 814 men who went down with Kaga deserve more than being remembered as statistics in a history book. They were sons and brothers and fathers and husbands. They were young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, who served their nation with the information and orders they received. They believed they were fighting for their country's security and future. They had families who waited for them, who mourned them, who carried that loss for the rest of their lives. The ethical responsibility to protect their resting place is absolute and non-negotiable. The final lesson Kaga teaches from the abyss is perhaps the most important one. Technological triumph and tactical genius cannot overcome strategic miscalculation. The same doctrine that delivered 6 months of seemingly unstoppable victories contained within it the seeds of catastrophic defeat. By concentrating all carriers together, Japan created a target-rich environment. By emphasizing preemptive strikes, they became vulnerable during the preparation phase. By assuming enemies would always be caught unprepared, they failed to account for intelligence breakthroughs, code breaking, and determined opponents willing to sacrifice everything for one perfect moment of opportunity. Kaga's wooden flight deck, that weight-saving compromise made to meet treaty restrictions, became the vulnerability that killed her when American bombs found her at the worst possible moment. The doctrine she helped perfect became the doctrine that destroyed her. The concentration of force that made the Kido Butai so devastating also meant that when American dive bombers found them, they found all their targets in one place. These lessons echo across the decades, relevant not just to naval warfare, but to any strategic endeavor. Overwhelming tactical success can mask strategic vulnerability. What works perfectly when you control the terms of engagement can fail catastrophically when those terms shift. The moment of maximum striking power is also the moment of maximum vulnerability. Innovation in one area can be undermined by compromise in another. Kaga's hull belongs to the fallen, to the 814 men who rest with her in the eternal darkness. Her story belongs to history, to everyone who studies warfare and strategy and human decision-making. And her silence speaks louder than any commentary could. She remains a guardian on the seafloor, teaching anyone willing to listen that the most profound lessons often come from the deepest places, that the line between triumph and catastrophe can be measured in minutes, in materials chosen for a flight deck, in assumptions made about enemy capabilities, and in the cruel mathematics of concentrated force, meeting perfect timing. 17,700 feet down, Kaga rests in peace. Her silence is her final contribution. Her preservation is our responsibility. Her lessons are our inheritance. And her story, now complete with the discovery of her final resting place, reminds us that every strategic choice carries consequences that may not be apparent until the moment they become fatal.